there. My name is Dr. Debbie Wake. I'm a diabetes physician, and I'm here to welcome you to the Q&A session as part of our Understanding Type 1 massive online course. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I just wanted to give a little bit of background, first of all, to what we're doing and a bit of an introduction to what the plan is for this evening. So between 5 and 6 tonight, we're going to be answering your questions on type 1 diabetes, mainly focusing on the content that we've covered as part of the online e-learning course that's been running throughout the course of today. The way the session will work is that we'll divide it into 4 sections. So we'll have a 10-minute Q&A. We'll then have a 5-minute break, which allows myself and the team to go away, have a look at the questions, and then we'll come back on again for another 10 minutes, 5-minute break, and we'll do that throughout the hour so that we'll have 4 sections and we'll be answering your questions as they come in. So what I'd encourage you all to do is to put your questions into the chat in Facebook. So hopefully it's pretty obvious. You can just add your questions into there, and myself and other members of the team will be picking those questions up. So anything you want to ask about, as I say, particularly about some of the content that we've covered today. To explain a little bit about the background to the course. So as mentioned, I'm Dr. Debbie Wake. I'm a diabetes consultant by background, but I work with a company called MyWay Digital Health, who are a spin-out company from Dundee University. And we work closely with NHS England and NHS Scotland to deliver digital platforms and services for people with diabetes. So the course running today and tomorrow has been done alongside sponsorship with NHS England. And we run a platform for NHS England called mytype1diabetes.nhs.uk. And this is a type 1 diabetes education platform that is there as an open access platform for anyone with diabetes in NHS England. And on that platform, there are many e-learning courses for people to go in and complete. And that platform is there 365 days of the year, 24/7 for you to go in and look at. So the course we've got running today and tomorrow is really an introduction to type 1 diabetes. We've made it very much open to not just people with diabetes, but carers, parents, healthcare professionals, anyone with an interest in type 1 diabetes who wants to learn more about it. But if you get to the end of the course and you think, actually, I want to find out more, then, as I say, go to the My Type 1 site, which has lots of educational resources divided into sections that anyone from around the world can go in and look at, and then you can refer into structured education courses. And we've got specific courses on certain topics like carb counting, if you want to know more about that, courses on insulin pumps, courses for young people with type 1, all about sort of growing up and living with type 1 diabetes, and then more in-depth courses on living with type 1 diabetes. So as I say, today and tomorrow is very much an introduction to topics, and that's where to go if you want a deeper understanding of those topics. So we'll be flagging that web address to you both throughout the Q&A and also when you complete the e-learning courses to direct you onto that as a kind of next step. So a bit about the course that we've had running. We've had about 1,600 people subscribed to the course, which has been absolutely fantastic response. It has meant, however, that we've had some technical gremlins today, that the internet hasn't been our friend, unfortunately, today. And the course at times has become very glitchy. We've had our technical staff working on this throughout the day to improve it and try and get the running speeds a bit quicker. So huge apologies to people out there who've been trying to access the course and who've been struggling. I think we now have it sorted. I've been on it in the last half hour. It's now working much better, much slicker, much quicker. So if you've struggled today to get access to it, please do go back and have another go. Also, just to remind you that the course material will actually be open for the next few days. So it stays open until Monday night at 5 o'clock. So there's plenty of time for you to go back and in your own time, complete the course material, get involved with the discussion boards, and to do that at your own time. So I'd encourage people to do that. Tomorrow, hopefully, we'll have more of you back on the course again, and we'll be covering a whole new set of subjects at that time. So I'm going to move on to some questions quickly because we're running out of time for this first section. As I say, we'll then break, come back to the second section. So one of the comments that I just wanted to pick up from earlier today was about carb counting. And about some additional aids that people can use to support carb counting. And I'd like at this point just to introduce one of my colleagues, because whilst I'm the face of this, we've got a whole team behind the scenes here who are supporting this, technical staff, education staff. And I'd like to introduce Salma Mehar, who is a dietitian. Salma, do you want to say hello and just introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Debbie. I'm Salma, and my background is I'm a dietitian, and I work with people with living with diabetes. And I've been delivering carbohydrate counting education for over 10 years now. I'm a definitely educator as well. So if you have any questions specifically around diet, carb counting, exercise, alcohol, and diabetes, please feel free to add them to the chat, and I would be more than happy to answer them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Salma. And I think while you're there, what I'd like to do is pick up on some of the comments that were coming through the e-learning today. And one was about tools and things that can help people with carb counting. So we touched on that today. Some people find it quite challenging, both in terms of estimating their carbohydrate content in their food, and then potentially, using that calculation in terms of working out their insulin dose. Any tips, particularly let's start with the carb estimation. Any tips you can give people?
So obviously this is something that we go into bad habits when we start talking about carbohydrates and counting carbs when it comes to guessing. But we try to encourage people to try to not to guesstimate, but to know exactly how much carbohydrates you are eating by using simple tools. And some of the tools that we normally recommend are carbohydrate books, counting books such as the Carbs and Cows calorie counting, and we've got this in Cultural Foods as well, which is the World Food Book. If you reference these books, they will give you exactly how much carbohydrate is by looking at visually at the picture, which helps people when you don't always have weighing scales, or if you know the portion, it will give you exactly how much carbohydrate is in the portion of food that you're eating. So, for example, if you're having potatoes or chips, portion of rice, pasta, and even things like chapatis, even other foods like cassava, yam. And I can just reference it to something. We've got some cultural foods such as polenta. And if you can just reference it with the portions that you might be eating, that will help you with carb counting. The best way to carb count is obviously to weigh out the foods that you're eating, know exactly the weight of the food, and then know the weight, and then know exactly how much carbohydrate in the food, and that will allow you to give you the correct amount of insulin. If you don't have the books, you can also use the Carbs and Cows apps. There are lots of different apps available out there. Some are at a cost and some are free of charge. But generally, we recommend Carbs and Cows because this is tested, it's evidence-based, and it's well used within our DAFNE programs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Salma. That's really helpful. One person on the course mentioned an app called NutriCheck, which they said was a really handy one they found when they were eating out. I don't know if that's one you've come across at all.
I have heard of NutriCheck. I believe that it includes a lot of sort of your commercial restaurants and eating out chains as well, which is really useful when you don't want to get out your scales and be weighing out food in restaurants, getting out your books. So NutriCheck, or even just going directly to the company website. And I think there is a law coming into place very soon that all food restaurants will need to have their nutritional values, which is not always a positive thing for many people, but for people with type 1 diabetes, that is going to be a huge benefit because we will have the carbohydrate values of all the foods and restaurants that you'll be eating. There's lots of information on the internet. There's also a very popular one, which people ask me about, is MyFitnessPal. So it generally has a lot of supermarket giant foods, etc. So if you're shopping in a supermarket and you want to click on scan the food labels, it will give you the nutritional values. But where it comes to cooked foods, such as what you're cooking at home or in restaurants, ideally you should know your portions and then weigh out or look at the pictures and calculate your carbohydrates.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really helpful, Salma. And just one other thing I wanted to ask about, because somebody asked about low carb in type 1 diabetes. And I know that there's a lot of work done on low carbohydrate diets for type 2 diabetes, which can be really helpful in terms of helping people lose weight and stabilize glucose levels. I think in type 1 diabetes, perhaps a little bit more controversial, or the evidence is maybe a little bit less. Any comments on that?
So we do know that people with type 1 diabetes have talked about, even on the course today, lots of people are referencing low carbohydrate diets, better management. At the moment, Diabetes UK and Daphne program, or our structured education program, doesn't necessarily reference type 1 diabetes as a low carbohydrate diets as a management for people with type 1 diabetes, purely because we don't have the evidence, and purely because I don't think, from my experience, there is a need to follow low carbohydrate diets if you know exactly how much carbohydrate is in the foods. You can give yourself the correct amount of insulin. What we have seen from people coming onto structured education programs is the more they are better at carb counting, generally tend to take less insulin, because that helps with their management. And the idea is not to stop all carbohydrates, but be well aware of where the carbohydrates are, have the flexibility of what you can and cannot eat, and not having to avoid all carbohydrates, because that is not what is going to improve your control. What will improve your control is knowing exactly how much carbohydrates is in the foods that you're eating. And the only way you will do that is by good practice, through weighing your foods, knowing exactly how much carbohydrate is in the foods, particularly if you are cooking foods at home. So a lot of the cultural meals that we prepare, and we don't always know. And also when we're eating out, portions are generally much different to what we eat at home. So the idea is around flexibility, and when it comes to low carb diets, we don't always promote these, because these can also lead to more hypos. And with younger people, there is a lot of controversy around low carbohydrate diets, and it's not sustainable. There's no evidence behind that it will improve your diabetes care. However, reducing carbohydrates can lower your blood glucose and help to lose weight if you are looking to lose weight.
That's really helpful. Thanks for that. Brilliant. What we'll do is we'll just take a short break for a couple of minutes. We're going to look at your questions in the chat and come back to you. In the next section, I'd like to cover a little bit on blood glucose targets. And there's been quite a lot of questions about nocturnal hypos and any tips to help with nocturnal hypos. So we'll definitely pick up on that in the next section. And then I'd also like to cover a wee bit later on something about Libra technology, blood glucose monitoring. Again, a lot of queries coming in about that. So we'll see you back again in a couple of minutes. Thanks. Hi again, everyone. Hi again. Great to have you joining us today. We've got a few more people joining the live stream, which is brilliant. If you weren't here at the start, just as a reminder, please put your questions in the chat on the Facebook page and we'll try and get through your questions. That's just come up on screen there. You can put things in Twitter as well, but it's quicker and easier for us to get to it on the Facebook stream. Thanks to those who've joined us. Just a recap on earlier. We're mainly covering questions linked in with the course material on the Type 1 course. Apologies to those who have had some technical problems today with the site. We think it is now all sorted. The site seems to be working much quicker. And just to reiterate that you do have all through the weekend until the end of Monday at 5 p.m. to go in and complete the information on the course. Keep telling people about it. We've got about 1,500, just over that, signed up to the course. There's still time for people, however, to come in and join the course. So if you know people out there who you think would benefit, either people with Type 1 diabetes or family members, carers, healthcare professionals, anyone, then please let them know about the course. Getting back to the questions, so I said I would answer something about blood glucose levels, so I'll pick that up just now, blood glucose targets, and also pick up on one of the questions which was about nocturnal hypos. So basically, blood glucose targets we mentioned in the course today, generally we say to people, ideally should be aiming for about 4 to 7 before meals, between about 6 and 8 before going to bed. And these are the 4 to 7 is a kind of fasting level, so a pre-meal fasting level. Sugar levels will go up a little bit often after you've eaten, although you can try and stabilize that out by getting the right insulin dose. And sugar levels should be above 5 when driving. I think a lot of people were responding on the course to say that's really hard, that's really tight. And I think we totally get that. And targets do need to be personalized. That's the first thing to say. And those targets may not be appropriate for everybody. And there may be people where actually avoiding hypoglycemia is really important. So we want to shift the targets up a little bit. So speak to your healthcare professional about what targets are the right targets for you. The targets I've given are in line with the national guidelines. And everyone, I think, with Type 1 diabetes does experience times when sugar levels are a bit high. Having occasional high sugar levels is normal and part of life, but it's just a target is something to aim for. It's not something you're going to achieve 24/7. It's something to aim for, and I think that's the general advice. Nocturnal hypos, a lot of people have asked about this. There are many reasons why blood sugar levels can go a bit low overnight, and it can either be due to too much insulin in the body overnight, or an impact on something that you've done the evening before. So if we focus on insulin, the main insulin that's in your body overnight is your long-acting insulin, presuming you're on basal bolus insulin. So this is insulin taken 4 times a day. If you're having hypos, particularly after 2 a.m. in the morning, it may be that your overnight insulin dose is too high. The only insulin that should be in your system from sort of midnight onwards for most people is your long-acting insulin that you've taken in the evening. So hypos are usually a result of a mismatch between the amount of insulin that's in the system and the amount of carbohydrate in the system. The other things that can make you go low overnight is if your meal intake in the evening, so the amount of carbohydrate you've taken in doesn't match the amount of insulin you've taken in at that meal time. So you've underestimated the carb or you've overestimated your insulin dose with your evening meal. Of course, that could make you go hypo, often earlier in the evening, because the short-acting insulin is usually in your system just for a few hours after your evening meal. Other things that can precipitate overnight hypos are alcohol. So we'll talk about alcohol in a minute. I might bring Salma in again just to talk about carb content of alcohol and how to deal with that in terms of carb counting. But alcohol has a sort of mixed effect. There is carbohydrate in some types of alcohol, which might make your sugar levels go a bit high. But a few hours after you've been drinking, alcohol can cause hypos. And it does this by working on an enzyme in the liver and by stopping sugar release from the liver. So it's quite common for people who've maybe drunk quite a lot of alcohol in the evening to have a hypo overnight or the following morning even. So important to be aware of that. And it may be that you need to take extra carbohydrate in the evening after drinking alcohol to make sure you don't go low overnight. And the other thing to think about is exercise. So when people exercise, it can have all sorts of impact on blood sugar levels. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow. We've got a big bit in the course tomorrow about exercise. But in general terms, if you've done quite a strenuous, reasonable length of exercise, it will affect your sugar levels at the time, but it can continue to affect your sugar levels for a number of hours afterwards. And if you've done exercise in the evening, for example, it could result in your metabolic rate being high overnight, you burning through more sugar and therefore being at risk of hypoglycemia overnight. So these are just some of the common things that may result in overnight hypos. So I would urge you to have a think about those, maybe keep a diary, see what it is that might be different on the days you have an overnight hypo. If you're on an insulin pump, it's a little bit easier to manage because your background basal rate could be changed overnight so that your pump excretes a bit less insulin overnight if you're having lots of hypos overnight. The great thing is things like the Libre systems, continuous glucose monitors, now really help us in monitoring those sugar levels overnight on a continuous level. And if you're using a Libre 2, it will actually have an alarm built in so that it can wake you up overnight if you are going low. So this sort of technology is really helpful. I'm going to bring in Salma again, though. So Salma, for anyone who wasn't in the first session, Salma is our dietitian expert. Salma, do you want to comment at all on carb counting when it comes to alcohol?
Sure. Thank you, Debbie. So when we are thinking about alcohol and carbohydrate, it's very important to know which type of alcohol will have carbohydrates in them and which type of alcohol do not contain any carbohydrates. So for example, if we are having drinks such as cider, alcohols, beer, port, cocktails, they generally tend to have carbohydrates in them. But other alcohols such as wine and also gin, tonics, they will have no carbohydrates in them. So when we are drinking, the advice is that we do be very mindful of how much we are going to drink, and generally the advice is that we don't count for the first couple of drinks because there's very little carbohydrates. But the thing we need to be more mindful of is the risks attached with hypoglycemia and drinking. But if we, tomorrow's session, we're going to cover alcohol a little bit more. The key thing is that we are aware of our hypo-awareness, and we're ensuring that we eat before we are going out or we're drinking, and then there's going to be more activity along with the drinking as well. Always the advice is to carry something with you, particularly if you are going to be in a particular social environment where there's not going to be food for a long time, or there's just drinks and no snacks or no meals. It's very important that you do carry some form of hypo treatment with you that you do need if in any reason you need to act quickly. Sometimes when we're thinking about alcohol and activities such as dancing, that's when we do need to be a bit more mindful of the hypos for the following days as well. And the advice is to either to reduce your insulin intake or to eat before you do go out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Salma. Really helpful advice there. And just picking up on another comment that came in on the chat about exercise, because we've mentioned exercise briefly. We will be covering more of this in the course tomorrow, but somebody, we got, I think it was from Sarah there, thanks, saying exercise always increases my blood glucose levels. How can I combat this? I've tried having a snack beforehand with and without insulin and so on. Exercise is really interesting because depending on the type of exercise you're doing, the intensity of it, and whether or not you have insulin on board in your system at the time of exercise will dictate what it does to your blood sugar levels. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but sometimes, as you say, you can see this converse increase in glucose levels during exercise. Most people exercise reduces your glucose levels by sort of burning through the sugar, if you like. But where we see an increase is usually in two situations. One is when you don't have any insulin on board. So if you imagine you might get up in the morning before breakfast, you've not had any food, you've not taken your morning insulin, and you go out for a run, your insulin maybe sort of levels might be quite low. Now, your body actually needs insulin to push sugar into the muscles. So if you don't have insulin on board, that sugar sits in your bloodstream. And whilst you're exercising and your body's really craving sugar, there is no insulin to push that sugar to where it needs into the muscles to be used for fuel while you're exercising. So what happens is, conversely, your liver keeps pushing out more sugar, but there's no insulin there to move that sugar into the tissue. So blood sugar levels rise. So it's really important to have insulin on board when you're exercising. So think about when you're exercising and think when your last insulin dose was. The other thing that can push your sugar levels up when you're exercising is if you're doing very fast, stressful, strenuous exercise like sprinting. So sprinting raises your adrenaline and your cortisol levels, and these hormones actually will push sugar levels up just by an impact on sort of glucose release in the liver. So again, short, very high intensity exercise can sometimes push sugar levels up. Some people actually use that to their advantage, that during a period of exercise, they might do a combination of sprinting, which pushes the sugar level up, and then slower, more sustained exercise, which brings the sugar levels back down. So once you kind of know and understand how your body reacts to different exercise, you can actually use that to help manage your sugar levels. But hopefully, Sarah, that's useful. And I might explain a little bit about why sugar levels might vary. I appreciate it sounds like you've tried lots of strategies. We've got some really good sheets tomorrow that you can download from the course that talk about different scenarios of exercise and different things to try. So hopefully that'll maybe give you something new that you might be able to try. That's helpful. Another one I was just going to pick up on quickly. Somebody asked, is there any advice for burnout? And I'll maybe bring Salma again in on this one. Depends a little bit what you mean by burnout. I'm guessing that I think a lot of people who've had diabetes, particularly for a long time, the daily burden of having to manage and think about diabetes constantly when you're eating, when you're exercising, and basically in everything you do, is incredibly stressful. And we know that people with diabetes have much higher levels of mental health problems than general population. It's about 2 to 4-fold. And I think the last 12 months has also put a lot of extra strain on people as well. So I'm not sure if that's what you mean by burnout, but I think I think there's general tips. Salma, I think you had maybe some thought on this.
Yeah, I agree, Debbie. There's a lot of work that is being doing currently around diabetes and mental health, and we recognise that people with diabetes, it can be quite stressful with the current climate, their work and situation, not being able to exercise, not being able to do things like they would have normally done, and with the lockdown, etc. So we've actually created some really useful resources on our website, which is under the No Diabetes website, and I'll add that into the chat soon. So on this particular website, we've got information on how you can be more relaxed, how you can improve your sleep, how you can meditate, how you can look at ways to feel better, improve better, looking at other avenues and not just exercise and healthy eating. We're looking at sort of organizations which offer the support, counseling, focus particularly around people with diabetes. And if you go into our website under No Diabetes, there is a whole section on mental health and well-being. And you'll find resources that will help you, particularly if you feel like you're burnout, or if you feel like it's too overwhelming at the moment, you're anxious, you're stressed. Do reference these pages, because we do have a lot of references, good links to Mind, and also other organizations which are working with people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes to develop resources which will help improve people's well-being and in return their diabetes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Salma. That's helpful. I think sleep is one important thing which I think is often overlooked. And there's some good resources there about how sleep is really important for helping with mental well-being, but also specifically in diabetes. And that can actually help with your insulin resistance and actually stabilizing sugar levels as well. So yeah, Gemma, thanks about that. And you've said yes, especially last year. So I think this last year has been tough for everybody. And I think people with diabetes as well have been under pressure with additional restrictions around what they can and can't do, and additional risks with COVID. So I think there's a link in the chat to No Diabetes, and there's some really nice resources there. We've developed some specific COVID pages during lockdown, and again that's focusing on some of these specific issues around stress, burnout, and so on. So hope you find something there that's helpful. I think peer support is really good as well, and this course is hopefully allowing people to share stories and hopefully share some hints and tips. So again, if anyone else has anything that they would like to comment around burnout or anything that's helped them, please put that in the chat as well. That would be brilliant. Great. We're just going to take 2 minutes just to come offline, have a wee look at your questions, and then we'll be back again in 2 or 3 minutes' time. Anything else you want to ask, do put it in the chat. I noticed there's a couple of things there from Samantha and Vince. We'll try and get to those in the next session and pick up any other comments too. Okay, speak to you again in a minute. Thanks. Hi again, Dr. Debbie Wake here for those who weren't in the last session. So I'm a diabetes consultant. I'm joined here by some of my colleagues tonight. So we're just continuing with some of your questions relating to the Understanding Type 1 course. So just going straight in, there was a couple of things quickly. I just wanted to pick up on carb counting. We covered that earlier in the Q&A. Somebody asking specifically about calculating basal insulin carb ratios. Now, there was something on the course today about how you can do this using something called the 500 rule. And what we will do is there are some additional little worksheets that we've got around carb counting and calculating insulin carb ratios, carb counting in general, and working out your basal ratio. So this principle of insulin to carb ratios is it's how much insulin you need to take for amount of carbohydrates. So a 1 to 10 ratio is 1 unit of insulin for every 10 grams of carbs. How do you work out whether your ratio is 1 to 10 or something completely different? It is a bit of trial and error, but there is a little bit of maths that you can do where you look at your total amount of insulin you take over 24 hours on average, and you basically take 500 and you divide it by that number. That then gives you a number, which is the amount of carb that should be covered by 1 unit of insulin. Now, if that doesn't make sense, as I say, we've got some downloadable little sheets that take you through all that, and we'll put some comments in the chat, and we can link it through to some resources. So if you're starting from scratch and that you're on maybe a different insulin regime, but you know how much insulin you take on average, adding up all your insulin, fast and long and short-acting insulin over the course of a day, you should be able to work out roughly what your insulin carb ratio should be. And then it's a case of trying it out. And if it works for you and you find that sugar levels are staying pretty steady after a meal, that's good. If the sugar levels are going low, you'll need to change the ratio. If they're going high, you need to change the ratio. And usually you can get to a point where the insulin carb ratio is right for you. Some people do need different insulin carb ratios for different meal times because they're a bit more sensitive to insulin at certain times in the day. So again, you'll find that out through a bit of trial and error. I just wanted to move on to one of the other comments in the chat about, let me see if I can just find it now, which was somebody was asking about low carb ketogenic diets and whether there was any issue in terms of neuropathy. So we covered a little bit in the last section about low carb diets and type 1 and limited evidence in that space. I think your question was about, the sort of safety of these diets, saying that some people advised a keto diet. I think, as mentioned, we wouldn't really recommend what we call ketogenic diets, particularly for people with type 1 diabetes. If you want to reduce your carbohydrate intake because you want to lose weight, that's fine. But you need to adjust your insulin accordingly. Once you get to what we call ketogenic diet, that's a really very, very low amount of carbohydrate in the diet. And at that point, your body will start to break down fat and produce ketones. Again, there's not much good evidence for that in people with type 1 diabetes, that's a useful strategy. So I think we wouldn't generally recommend that. Salma, do you want to come in again on anything there relating to sort of ketogenic diet, in particular in this situation? I'm assuming it's sort of similar advice to what you gave earlier.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information coming from the internet around the globe around ketogenic diets and the benefits, and there's conflicting advice around type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And I think recently there's been a lot of interest in ketogenic diets, low carb, because of new evidence coming out and the improvements in type 2 diabetes. But unfortunately, there's very little work that's been done on with people with type 1 diabetes. So what I would say is that people living with type 1 diabetes, they have that flexibility. If they want to have carb-free meals, if they want to skip their meals and not take any insulin, that's absolutely fine. But just to follow a ketogenic diet for a short period of time to lose weight, or just to for a particular exercise regime, or you're trying to figure out your fitness levels, etc., is absolutely fine. But it's not sustainable, it's not long term, and also we don't advise it in young people. There's lots of issues around healthy eating, diet, etc. So long term, there are no benefits of following a ketogenic diet for people with type 1 diabetes. The flexibility is there, and if you are very good at carb counting, there is no harm in having carb-free days.
Brilliant, really helpful, Salma. Thanks for that. And I'll just get you to answer one more question while we've got you. Somebody was asking about when you're carb counting, you know, about fiber. A lot of foods with fiber are sort of starchy carb, and yeah, just any comments on fiber.
So I forgot to mention earlier, Debbie. So one of the ways we can carb count is by food labels, and obviously that's where this has come from, because you won't know the fiber intake unless you're looking at a food label. Because most resources, most apps, and most information guides won't necessarily have the fiber content. So the advice is no, we don't deduct the fiber content, because a lot of the fibrous foods will have carbohydrates in them, so such as fruit, vegetables, lentils, pulses, grains, as you know, they are considered as high fiber foods, but they still have carbohydrates, and we do count the carbohydrates for these foods. So anything that will have carbohydrates might have some fiber, so because they will have either a high fiber, low fiber index, so you will still need to count the carbohydrate in all carbohydrate foods. And the best way to do that is either by using the Carbs and Cows calorie counter books, apps, food labels, or the supermarket apps if they have any, or the food packaging.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alma. Really helpful. I'm going to move on to talking a bit about diabetes technology. And I think there's been a lot of commentary throughout the course, both on glucose sensing technology, the Libre being the thing that's been talked about most, but also insulin pumps. And I can see a question in the chat about I'm finding it hard to know exactly what pump to upgrade to. Everything's gone digital because of the pandemic. Not being able to have the pump in front of me to see, it was a difficult decision to make. Any advice about choosing pumps during this time? So I think thinking about both pumps and glucose monitoring systems, I'm going to bring in another colleague who you've not met yet tonight, and that's Dr. Alex Bickerton. Alex, do you want to just say hello and do a wee intro?
Hi, yeah. So I'm Alex Bickerton. I'm a consultant in Somerset, and I've got a particular interest in technology and pumps, as it happens. So I think the question is, it is hard during the pandemic, because with pumps, really, you want to kind of get a feel for them, and there isn't any evidence that any one pump is actually better than any other pump. Some pumps suit some people better than they suit others. So I haven't really got an answer to your question, because I think really it's a question of getting back in touch with your diabetes team and seeing what they can do. Different people are doing different things during the pandemic. A lot of stuff has gone virtual, but some people seem to be managing that better than others. So I would go back to your team, do as much looking as you can online, because there is a lot out there. And again, it's often worth looking at the Diabetes UK site, because they have groups which will discuss and share experience, which is the main thing of different pumps. So that's what I would say to that question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Alex. I agree with that. I think it is hard when you don't physically have the thing to look at and push buttons, because often, we bring people in and we'd be able to show them a few different things and they'd look at it and you get a better look and feel. But I think online there are lots of videos and lots of user groups as well. I agree. The other thing, if you're thinking about an insulin pump in more general terms, but you're not sure whether it's the right decision for you, again, I would go back to our mytype1diabetes.nhs.uk site, which has a specific course that is called Considering an Insulin Pump. And it's for people who are thinking about doing the step onto insulin pump therapy, maybe need to understand a bit more about it. And it will talk about some of the different pumps that are available, things like some of the tubeless pumps versus the more traditional pumps. So that's quite a good place to start for some general information. In addition to the My Type 1 education site, which is available to everyone in NHS England, we do have some regional sites as well. So if you live in certain areas like Lancashire, South Cumbria, Cheshire, Merseyside, Greater Manchester, Northwest London, Northeast London, or Somerset, then actually all these areas have regional My Way diabetes sites as well, including the No Diabetes site that you heard Salma talk about. And again, loads of information on these websites as well. During the course, at the end of it, we will link you through to all these regional sites as well. So if you're in one of those regions, we'll link you to those sites. You can access educational material, and you can also register to access all your health data online as well. So you can keep track of your results as well as accessing the educational material. So that is all coming soon, and you'll get that on the course. I wanted to just, in terms of technology, talk a little bit about Libre as well. And again, I'll maybe bring Alex back in for this one, because I think a lot of people have been talking about Libre and the old Libre, and then they move on to the Libre 2. And some people are still on the first Libre, some are on Libre 2. And then there's some people who haven't yet moved on to flash glucose monitoring, who are still using traditional finger prick tests, and who are a little bit wary of this move on to Libre. And I'd just be interested to hear from you about your patients' experiences of maybe using the Libre, and then we could talk a little bit more about the difference between the Libre and the Libre 2 and the advantages that has.
Okay, so the Libre, I mean, our experience of the Libre is that a lot of people really love it. It gives you a lot of information, and with the Libre 2, it has the added facility to set alarms. And in fact, our experience is that is a real game changer for a lot of people. When the Freestyle first came out, it is really, really helpful, because as well as knowing what your sugar is doing at the moment, it also tells you which direction your sugar is going. And a lot of people find actually the directional arrows as useful, if not more useful, than the actual number. But on top of that, as long as you scan adequately, so you need to scan really to keep the technology, you should be scanning 8 times a day. And as long as there is less than an 8-hour gap between scans, the Libre will measure the sugar in between times as well. And the real time that's been a benefit is looking at your sugars overnight, because people do struggle with sugars low or high overnight, and previously have had to wake up in the middle of the night to do sugar tests to see what's happening with that. So the Libre gives a massive amount of information, and being able to set alarms on the Libre 2 is even more useful, because again, if you're thinking about times when you might not be monitoring, and particularly overnight, if you can set an alarm that goes off and wakes you up and tells you that you're low, that's really helpful. So the experience has been really good generally. There are some people who don't get on with it, and there are a number of reasons for that. Some people have technical issues with the actual sticking getting the thing to stick in and stay in. There are some people who find it's actually too much information, and it can be overwhelming. I would say that with some support and using the data in a sort of pragmatic, common sense way, and not getting too hung up on it, then those people have actually found it not so overwhelming. But some people do find it too much and find they're reacting to it too much and don't get on with it. But generally, our experience is that most people absolutely love it.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful advice. Totally agree with that. And I think, my experience is that the majority of people, I say, have seen it as a bit of a game changer. I think some people on the course as well were worried about the accuracy of it, because they'd heard it wasn't as accurate as finger prick testing. And I think the difference with the Libre is you're really following trends rather than following absolute numbers. And that's, some people, just takes a bit of time for you to get your head into that. But because in theory you can get blood sugar levels every 5 minutes, what you're doing is you're seeing when your sugar is about to go up dramatically, when it's about to go down dramatically, and you're actually able to sort of preempt what's happening with your sugar levels. And following those trends is more important than maybe the absolute number. But you do need to be aware that if you're feeling low and your Libre's telling you that you're not low, you should go on instinct, and you should probably check a finger prick test just in case the absolute number isn't quite right. And there will always be a bit of a lag between what the Libre is telling you and what a finger prick test would tell you. So go on feeling, but I think, being able to kind of preempt these trends, I think a lot of people find really useful. Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Really good advice. I'm just going to pick up a comment in the chat. I think it was from possibly Daniel, apologies if I've got the name wrong, saying I was initially diagnosed with type 2, but 2 weeks ago was changed to a type 1 diagnosis following blood tests finally coming back, saying it's been over 3 weeks. You're on metformin, been started on insulin, been given some rough insulin doses to take, and you're waiting to see the specialist, and you're not sure about how often you should be testing. That all sounds like a really stressful, unsettling time for you, Daniel. So it sounds like you're coping really well with that, and there's a lot to get to grips with there. I think once you get in touch with your specialist team, you'll be given more advice. But I think for anyone with a new diagnosis of type 1, it will often take weeks and several months to get fully up to speed with everything they need to know and to feel comfortable with managing it. So thanks for joining us on the course, and I think hopefully you're going to get some useful information from us. Specifically about how often you should be testing, what we would generally say to people who are newly diagnosed with type 1 is to try to test before every meal and last thing at night as a kind of minimum. So 4 times a day, I'd say is kind of the minimum. That's useful because the pre-meal tests give you an idea of what your blood sugar level is just before eating and just before you're about to take your next insulin injection. So you can kind of take that into account. Before bed, it's always good to check your blood sugar levels, and we generally recommend ideally between about 6 and 8 is great. If your sugar's dropping low before bed, then you know to maybe eat some carbohydrates so that you're not risking overnight hypos. But you may find you want to check at other times. We would always say to people, check before driving. Any blood sugar level should be at least 5 before driving. If you're driving long distances, check at least every 2 hours if you're driving a longer distance. And obviously, if you are feeling low, you think a hypo might be coming on, or you've got any other symptoms, then obviously check as well. When you're starting carbohydrate counting for the first time and you're wanting to know whether the dose of insulin you've taken and your insulin carb ratio is correct, you might find yourself checking a bit more often. So maybe an hour or two after you eat, just to see whether that insulin dose has actually worked and whether it's kept your blood sugar level steady or whether your sugar has risen or fallen after food. And that'll give you some feedback on your insulin carb ratio. So hopefully that's a little bit of advice to at least get you started. As I say, it sounds like you're doing the right thing. Often at the start it is a case of maybe getting on just some sensible doses of insulin, and over time you'll gradually get to a place where those doses are a little bit more personalized to you. You'll start to do the carb counting, and things will move forward from there. Hope that's useful. So somebody's asked about whether the Libre is widely available on the NHS. I'd love to try it and gain access. So yes, generally, if you have type 1 diabetes, you should be able to access the Libre now. Certainly that is the case in NHS Scotland, and in NHS England, there's been a massive push to make sure that everyone with type 1 can access Libre. Alex, I'll maybe just bring you in there again, just to comment on the NHS England situation, just in case there is any regional variation.
Yeah, I think that certainly historically there was a massive variation, and I think NHS England are trying to push it out so that it is a bit more standardised. I mean, there are criteria for having the Libre, which we probably covered, but essentially you need to be checking your sugars 8 times a day before you qualify, and that should be for 3 months. And then you do need to be getting, and that is basically the bottom line. There are a little bit more than that, because there are some people who qualify without that. And then to continue on the Libre, and that's really the important thing, because it's great getting it, but it's only worth using it if it's a tool that you actually want to use. So there are criteria for that as well, which is making sure you continue to, when you scan 8 times a day, but also to engage with your diabetes team. And there is an encouragement as well to be doing some carbohydrate counting or working towards that. But as I say, yeah, I do understand that it does vary a bit across the UK, but those are the NHS England guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. Just picking up on another comment in the chat, somebody asked, saying that their daughter having trouble sleeping, and where is it? Here we go. I think it was Tara. Yep. Saying on the whole, dealing with things brilliantly. I'm assuming that's diabetes-wise, and sometimes it doesn't seem to be related necessarily to blood sugar levels. And yeah, appreciate when you've got a young one, don't know how old your daughter is, but not sleeping at night, that can be pretty tiresome for the whole family. So yeah, sympathy with all of that. Sleep and diabetes, interesting one. Again, there is some specific resource which we can link you to on the No Diabetes site, which is a little resource which talks about diabetes and sleep. Certainly, people not sleeping overnight can be a consequence of either high blood sugar levels, because if sugar levels are high, that can have impact on sort of brain function, but it can also mean that people might be needing to get up and go to the toilet in the night, because high sugar levels mean you tend to want to pass more urine. Low blood sugar levels, obviously having hypos overnight, again, will wake people up, can cause sleep disturbance. So knowing the blood sugar levels are stable overnight is really important. And again, that's where some of this glucose monitoring technology can be really helpful, particularly the Libre 2, where you might have alerts around high and low sugar levels. So trying to keep the sugar as tight as you can within a narrow range overnight can be really helpful. If you think it's not related in any way to blood glucose levels, then I guess it is just about thinking about other things that might more generally impact on sleep, which might not be related to diabetes, but stress, thinking about sort of food intake in the evening, and thinking about trying to develop a very regular routine in the evening in terms of bringing down anxiety levels, doing the run up to bedtime to try and keep things kind of calm. Also thinking about exercise in the evening time. Is there differences in maybe how much a person's exercising? Sometimes exercise in the evening can have a positive or a negative effect on sleep. So sometimes keeping a diary maybe of food, activity, exercise, and other things that might be impacting on sleep can sometimes help if you think it's definitely not related to glucose levels. Don't know if any of the other team, Salma or Alex or anybody, have any thoughts on that one. Can maybe bring you both in.
Something which has worked for many people I've spoken to is switching off from screen time stuff. Funny enough, because a lot of us, the first thing we do before we go to bed is check our phones, and just having that time to switch off from everything else, and trying to avoid screen time at least an hour before you go to bed. Try that. Other very ad hoc therapies, such as lavender oils, that helps for some people. Relaxation music, and just staying very calm, not eating too late. These are just simple things that we have discussed with many groups in the past.
Yeah, thanks, Salma. That's great. And just coming back in, Daniel's just responded to our advice earlier, saying thank you for the response and saying you're on a fixed dose of insulin in the morning only at the moment. So yeah, what I would do, I think if you're just taking a morning dose, and I'm assuming that's maybe just a once a day long acting dose of insulin, which might be a reasonable start. Usually when we have people with a type 1 diagnosis, we want to get them on a long-acting insulin once a day or twice a day, which covers that background basal insulin, and then insulin with every mealtime. So I'm guessing, assuming your type 1 diagnosis is confirmed, that they'll want to progress on to mealtime insulin as well. At the moment, I think what you can do is just look at what's happening at mealtimes and seeing whether you are getting that blood sugar level rise at mealtimes. And again, that will help determine your sort of requirements that you're going to need for mealtime insulin as well. But yeah, keep in touch with your healthcare professional team. Your insulin, your once a day insulin will keep you safe. At the time of diagnosis, the important thing is get some insulin into the system, get the sugar levels generally down a bit, keep you safe, and also try and avoid maybe in that early period really high refined sugary foods that are going to cause glucose fluctuations, which at the moment, if you're not carb counting and you're not able to take fast acting insulin, you can't really counter that. So maybe just watch the sugar content in the diet, keep monitoring the sugar levels, and yeah, speak to your healthcare professionals. But hopefully that was useful. Another thing I was just going to pick up on earlier, some people asked about honeymoon period. And just to cover that very briefly, because there seemed to be a little bit of confusion about honeymoon period. And again, this might be relevant for you, Daniel, having been recently diagnosed. The honeymoon period is that initial period when you've just been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, where your pancreas gland is still producing a bit of insulin. So as discussed, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. The immune system, for various reasons, we think it might be induced by viruses, COVID being one of the viruses that's been linked, coronavirus, to type 1 diabetes, but there are other viruses as well. And often it's a combination of that in somebody who's got an immune system that for whatever reason is a bit more susceptible. So often, there can be cases of type 1 running in families, people who have immune systems that are a little bit more susceptible, and then they maybe get a second hit with a virus and it causes type 1 diabetes. Now, during that period, the beta cells in the pancreas become destroyed. But usually what happens is they don't become completely destroyed all at once. They drop down to about 50% of their functionality. And as they begin to then drop lower, the insulin that they're producing, the levels of that become low enough that the glucose levels start to rise. But often it can take several months, even up to a year, before the pancreas and the beta cells are completely destroyed. So you may have your first year of diabetes when you need insulin, but your body is still producing a little bit of natural insulin itself. So the insulin you need to inject, the amount of that isn't as much. And also your ability to cope with things like hypos is better, because your body still has some natural kind of physiology working to control the blood sugar levels. After that initial few months, or sometimes that initial year, eventually your body completely stops producing insulin as these beta cells completely die out. And your insulin requirements at that point will usually increase. You'll become completely reliant on the insulin you're injecting or getting through your insulin pump. And people sometimes find their risk of hypos is a little bit more, and it might be a little bit harder to treat hypos, more susceptible to fluctuations in sugar levels. So hopefully that explains a little bit about honeymoon period. It's just that came up quite a lot in some of the discussion earlier today. Just looking through the chat again for anything else. Again, I will bring in the others here just to talk about if anybody else wants to cover anything else. They're talking either about honeymoon period or other topics. One of the other things that came up was around pancreatic disease and the difference between diabetes that's been induced by destruction of the pancreas, maybe pancreatitis, or somebody who's had removal of the pancreas, and whether that should be treated in any different way to type 1 diabetes. Alex, do you want to comment briefly on sort of pancreatic disease and the similarities with type 1?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we're actually seeing more of this, and whether that's a COVID thing or not a COVID thing, but certainly in my clinical practice, I seem to get asked about it a lot more. Essentially, the pancreas has a significant amount of tissue in it, and within that there are hormone-producing cells which produce both insulin and also the opposing hormone called glucagon. And it is quite difficult to know how much of your pancreatic function you've got to sort of lose before it stops being effective in terms of producing insulin, but it's likely to be a very significant amount. Once you've lost that function for whatever reason, whether it's removed from surgery or pancreatitis causes inflammation and death of those cells, then it's not coming back. And essentially, in type 1 diabetes, the way the pancreatic cells are destroyed is autoimmune, but there are these other ways that they can be destroyed. And essentially, the end result is the same, is an inability to produce any insulin. So in terms of treatment, once there really is no insulin production from the pancreas, then it is akin to type 1 diabetes. The other thing that can be slightly more difficult with pancreatic diabetes is hypoglycemia, because as I mentioned, the pancreatic cells produce both sorts of hormone. And if the cells producing the hormone that will push sugars back up again, the glucagon, are also lost, then hypos can be very difficult to treat. So it's becoming more often common, but I do think, yeah, essentially it should be treated very similar to type 1 diabetes. And there is an argument, although it's not within the NHS England criteria, for the use of Libre in this group of people as well, because essentially the pathology, the end result is the same.
Yeah, no, great, Alex. And we've had a few people on the course today who've had pancreatic diabetes, and we've been encouraging them to say that basically a lot of the advice is exactly the same. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks for that. I'm going to pick up on one more question in the chat, and then I think we're getting close to the hour, and I'd like to just tell you a little bit about sort of next steps. So the question in the chat is, my daughter's been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 10 years now. She was 4 when she was diagnosed, but is getting older. Obviously, she's prone to lots of hypos overnight. Background insulin has been reduced, still having hypos overnight. What's your advice? So we touched on overnight hypos earlier, and I think, as mentioned, there's often a lot of reasons for overnight hypos. It can be due to the basal, the evening insulin, background insulin being too high, because often that's the only insulin that's in the system overnight. It can be due to things like alcohol, which shouldn't be hopefully an issue here, causing hypos overnight. It can be due to activity levels and exercise. So again, if this is only happening on certain nights, it'd be worth looking at those nights when there's maybe more activity or certain sports happening in the house, particularly if it's in the late afternoon, evening time. That can impact on overnight hypos as well. And again, just looking at the food content in the evening and thinking about, is there anything different, both in terms of, is the insulin carb counting really right at that time in the evening? It may be that the carbs are the same amount of carbs, but is it carbs that are slightly more slow released rather than fast release? So thinking about, is there anything different about the evenings or the day before when the hypos are happening as opposed to the days when they're not happening? Sometimes it can be really difficult to manage overnight hypos for people who are on basal bolus insulin, and sometimes if that becomes a problem that you really can't handle with the regime you're on, we sometimes can change that so that actually you change the long-acting insulin to the morning, or you put people on a type of insulin that doesn't last quite the full 24 hours, so it might start to wear off overnight, which can actually be beneficial for people who are having overnight hypos. Or the other thing is sometimes an insulin pump, because the great thing about an insulin pump is that you can change the background rates. So if somebody's prone to overnight hypos, you can drop that background rate right down overnight and then bring it up again in the morning. particularly for people who are maybe used to sort of big spikes in blood sugar levels in the morning, something called the dawn phenomenon, which is something else we sometimes see. Any of the other team want to comment anything on nocturnal hypos, anything that I've maybe missed, or other advice? Alex, any thoughts?
Yes. So the only other things that cross my mind is that I think in the question, this was a young lady who's now probably about 14, and where you are in terms of in having periods can affect your blood sugars as well. Generally, just before people come up for periods, the sugars tend to go high. But if you then make adjustments, the risk is that you'll then run hypo, and that can obviously be overnight. And that was the main thing I was thinking. The only other thing, as well as splitting the insulin, sometimes we change the background insulin because there are different insulins with different profiles, which I think you may have alluded to as well. Those were the main things I thought of.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. Great. Great. I think we're coming to the end of time. Salma, did you have any final comments? I know there has been more questions in the chat, and if we can't answer them tonight, we can try and send you some feedback in the chat at the end of the session here. But yeah, any final thoughts from you, Salma?
No, just that there is an extensive carb counting course on the MyWay Diabetes program. So if you want to learn more about carb counting, you can go into the website, and there is, we'll send you the details now. So do visit the website to learn more about carb counting in detail.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Great. Alex, any final comments from you?
No, just hope everyone's enjoying it and learning lots.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that. There's a few other comments in the chat about sort of postcode lotteries for Libra 1 to Libra 2. Somebody talking about pancreatic cancer, which I think ties in with what Alex was just talking about losing pancreas function and so on. So we will try and respond to your comments in the chat. I just want to finish by saying thanks everyone for contributing tonight. That's been really helpful. If anybody missed the start of this, what we'll do is we do a video recording of this and we send it out to everyone on the course anyway. So anyone who's missed the live Q&A can get a chance to watch it afterwards. So it's always going to be there on recap for you or anyone else who wants to watch it. Please continue to refer people into the Understanding Type 1 MOOC course. Apologies again for the technical problems we had to deal with the course. So if you were trying to access content today and you were struggling to do that, we think we've now solved the technical problems, that the site should be working much better. We are going to keep it open until at least 5 o'clock on Monday. And if people get back to us and say they need more time, we can possibly keep it open for another 24 hours after that, just to make up for the problems that we've had today. So let us know if that is an issue for you. But as I say, I encourage you to get back on and work your way through the material in your own time. It's going to be there. Discussion boards are still going to be live. You're still going to get the same benefits from doing the course. So thanks again for joining us tonight. It's been great to have you. And the website link that's live there is for the My Type 1 site. So if after you've done the 2-day course you want more information, or you want to do further courses on specific topics that we've talked about, that's where to go for more information and more e-learning. Great to engage with you all tonight, and we'll be here again tomorrow night doing exactly the same. So hopefully see you then. Thanks.